an opportunity to do something that could be phenomenal. And I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad, this could be so magnificent.
What does Donald Trump actually mean, and what has the reaction been around the rest of the world? We will unpick all of that in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast, which for one night only comes from the Radio Theatre at the BBC HQ in London, where we are marking 5 years since we started making this daily podcast. Hello, it's Adam in the Radio Theatre.
And it's Chris in the Radio Theatre.
And it's Laura, the Radio Theatre. Not yet allowed to put my hat on.
And it's Paddy in the Radio Theatre.
And just to explain, Laura's reference to hats is because we're marking our 5th birthday, so our entire audience and some of the people on this stage have got pointy party hats with them. But I wasn't sure if all the news stories today are quite appropriate for wearing a party hat.
Very good point.
Also, I'm just going to check with the audience. Is there anyone in the audience that still doesn't know that the last person you hear in the music is Shania Twain? Because people still ask who that is.
Do they?
Yes.
Surely not. I mean, honestly. Not the great Shania. You must know who she is. Surely.
So, how have you been marking Newscast's 5th birthday? Have you been doing anything today special?
From the moment I woke up, that was the first thing on my mind. I don't know about all of you.
Well, I think the big media story is the departure of Kay Burley from Sky News.
Yes.
Happening at the same time, a deliberate spoiler for the 5th birthday.
I mean, there is an empty seat next to you, Paddy.
It's her.
Is that the big
all
reveal?
the way.
Oh.
Can you imagine me replaced by Kay Burley? Like for like, I suppose.
Well, we never see you in the same room, do we?
So I thought my big vision was that for our birthday, we turned Broadcasting House into Podcasting House.
Oh,
Get it?
see what you did there.
Very good.
Get it?
Very good.
Most people didn't buy into it, but a few people did.
Story of our lives.
So this morning I did a shift as a security guard.
Did you really?
Yeah. I was quite low-key in my policing of the situation.
I was going to say, if there were people marauding towards me, there's no one else I'd rather have as my big security guard.
I mean, they come in all shapes and sizes now, security. Then I learned how to actually use the coffee machine in the cafe. So that's quite a good life skill I learned. Then I went on Jeremy Vine on Radio 2 and did the traffic and travel.
Did you?
Yes.
Did anybody hear it?
Did you really?
Yeah, some hands up. Was he any good?
Did you have a seamless journey as a result? And then I went, actually where I felt most comfortable was on Matt Chorley's show on 5 Live, doing his Westminster News in a Minute, which was basically just reading things out about politics, which is about 98% of what my career has been. So that worked out quite well. So that's how I've been marking it. Right, I think at this point we're going to bring on one of our friends of Newscast, because one of the big stories that we woke up to this morning was about the Middle East and Donald Trump's comments about the Middle East and his unique vision for what could happen to Gaza. So I think somewhere in this building, and hopefully joining us on this stage, is our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. Jeremy Bowen, more famous than all of us, clearly. Jeremy, we'll just get your microphone sorted out.
Am I meant to wear the hat?
Not yet.
Right now.
Not yet. Did you know there were going to be 500 newscasters sat here watching you? Or is this a surprise?
I had no idea at all. And then when I heard it was in the Radio Theatre, I thought maybe there might be 1 or 2 people. But no, well, welcome everybody to our humble home.
Now, seamlessly segueing, how surprised were you when you heard Donald Trump's comments about his vision for what to do about Gaza?
Well, I couldn't really believe my ears, to be honest with you. I mean, it's surreal. Everybody who follows these things thought that when he went to the White House, when Netanyahu went to the White House to see Trump, that he would they'd be talking about the ceasefire in Gaza. The current first stage is still going on. They meant to start talking about the second stage. But instead, he came out with this, extraordinary suggestion that America takes control of Gaza, that nearly 2.5 million Palestinians are removed or leave. He thinks that they would leave. That Egypt and Jordan take them in, provide new homes for them, though America's not going to pay for that. Meanwhile, America gets this incredible real estate opportunity. And what was also, I thought, I mean, to be honest, since you are talking about people's homes, pretty repellent, was the way they used the language of real estate to talk about it. This is a demolition site. This is a great opportunity. This could be the Riviera. Actually, it's also people's homes, or were, and they still consider it to be their home. So, yeah, I was amazed.
And Laura, Jeremy used that word extraordinary, and quite often we are just reporting the news, analysing the news, but then occasionally there's moments where a person says something that is so out of the ordinary, it becomes extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think it was a proper jaw-dropper. So during the re-election campaign for Donald Trump, there were plenty of things that he said on the campaign trail, like, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine on day one. By the end of the campaign, that had already moved back to, well, maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe 100 days. So it's not like we were short of things that were controversial that Donald Trump had put out there. And we were all used to that from his first term, as well as the campaign. This, however, was something that had just not been on the radar at all. It just like fell from a clear blue sky. What's interesting to me, though, is I just wonder what his real game is here. So I was talking to somebody in Westminster about this morning who's well connected into the Trump camp, who's close to some of the people who were around during Trump 1.0. And they sort of said, well, look, this is what he does. So he does the shock factor. He knows that nobody's going to sign up to this. And yet you put something out there that is so outrageous that when you put forward what you really want, which this morning might have seemed radical, but not completely off the reservation, that actually, almost with relief, you end up that people sign up to that. They go, well, it's not the really thing that was on the edge of any possibility, so therefore we can work towards this. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is what's going on here, but if you look at past form from him, you put something out there that's incredibly otherworldly, and actually you end up then people move a bit. So maybe that's what this is about. And there are plenty of examples of that that are much less radical in our own politics as well. I mean, the example I often use is, I know, Chris, you probably remember this too, the 90 days detention under New Labour, right? People have told me subsequently, they never thought they were going to get 90 days, but they put 90 days out there. Everybody was so shocked, you can't possibly do that, that they ended up, I think if I remember correctly, because it is quite a long time ago, they ended up with 28, and their opponents were so sort of relieved that that was a compromise they got. But, I mean, as Jeremy says, this is something that nobody would have expected. And it is so, the language, too, is not language of any kind of diplomacy that might be acceptable.
But, you know, even if it doesn't work out the way that he says it's going to, and it's not going to work out the way exactly that he wants, it's going to have an impact because he's the president of the United States, and words have consequences, particularly in the Middle East, where people are super sensitive to every nuance. And this wasn't nuance. This was a massive, 50-ton weight landing on their heads.
So what are some of the actual concrete consequences of what he said today, then?
I think what it will do, first of all, I spoke to a very senior Arab diplomat who said this could be the death knell for the ceasefire in Gaza, one. I think that what it also does is it presses big buttons in the minds of Israelis and Palestinians. On the Israeli side, it nurtures the plans, I was going to say fever dreams, but actually there are concrete plans that the ultra-nationalist Jewish right has in Israel to resume the war, expel the Palestinians in one way or another, and replace them with Jewish settlers. So it feeds all of that. And because they believe that between the River Jordan and the sea, it's all God-given Jewish land. And one of their number, Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, who's in the cabinet, he has said the Jewish state should go as far as Damascus. He's not joking either. And on the Palestinian side, it feeds into, what is really the central narrative of what they would see as their struggle for independence, freedom, and nationhood, which is the theme of dispossession. 1948, establishment of Israel, more than 700,000 Palestinians either booted out by the Israeli forces or fleeing ahead of them. never allowed to go back. The Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Now, you speak to it. I spent, since 7th of October, I have spent such a long time over there. And I'm telling you, you cannot talk to a Palestinian who does not, and of course, we can't get into Gaza and talk directly to them, but you can talk to many others. You cannot talk to one Palestinian who doesn't believe that they are in the middle of a repeat of 1948, a moment of genocide, and they now, I think, will be believing that President Trump has put the considerable weight of the United States even more behind that project than previously they'd believed.
Paddy, what questions do you want answered about all of this?
I think as listeners to the Radio 4, a woman wrote to me to say, can you stop covering Donald Trump? Because if we're going to cover everything he says, we're not going to talk about anything happening in the European Union, anything happening in the United Kingdom, because he says something every hour. So for me, this is the meeting point. I rely on Jeremy a lot, because the vision that he outlined isn't going to happen. In terms of deeds, a plan to relocate Palestinians living in Gaza to Egypt and Jordan is not going to happen. So that's what he said 24 hours ago, and it's not going to happen. And the whole world is talking about it because Jeremy is telling us words have consequences. So you ask me, what question do I want answered? The question I'd like answered by Chris, for instance, is if you're the British government and if you're a listener, a newscaster, how do you filter the latest flood the zone remark from the world's most powerful man with our life here, our real concerns about cost of living in the UK? There's only so much bandwidth. How do I know as a newscaster or a member of the government what to talk about with my 1 hour a day?
So I think that is one of the central questions that a lot of people in government are wrestling with in terms of their political and diplomatic reaction to Donald Trump returning to the White House. It's also a journalistic question for us about the extent to which there is a repeat, if you like, of what happened during the first Donald Trump term, which was that constant waking up to discover what he'd tweeted overnight, and so often that becoming a prevailing story of the day, and the extent to which it is right to carry on doing that, and or over time there is a calibration versus if we conclude there is a gap between what he frequently says and then what he later does. But on the point around government, at the moment, and we've seen this in the last couple of days with what the president said about tariffs, you can see the Prime Minister here trying to walk this incredibly difficult diplomatic tightrope walk between maintaining an open relationship with a new incumbent in the White House. The exchanges publicly between the two of them, particularly those coming from America, from Donald Trump, have been, well, uncannily A, positive, and B, conventional in terms of diplomacy. You might have expected more brickbats in the way that there have been ones thrown in the direction of the European Union and China and Mexico and Canada, etc., etc. And coming up in the next few weeks, the Prime Minister will be going, guess where? The White House. And doing a news conference, no doubt, with the President, where there will be questions, of course, about the Middle East, as well as about the quote-unquote special relationship that British governments like to use to describe our relationship with the United States. So, long-winded answer, which is a newscast specialism, Paddy, but that central question is a really important one within government. And as I say, if we're reflecting on, in the company of newscasters, how we go about the next 4 years, I think it's a live question for us as well.
And Laura, back to your point about Trump raising things in an exaggerated way. I mean, it has got me thinking today about the reconstruction of Gaza, because if we're in a world where it's really hard to get emergency aid supplies in, like polio vaccines or food for babies, how do you get all the building supplies in that you will need to rebuild a completely shattered piece of territory? And so you realize, but then you think, well, hang on, even that, there's several huge political steps have to be achieved before we even get into the actual kind of bricks and mortar stuff, which Trump was talking about in such a bizarre way.
Massively. And there's, as Jeremy highlights, in a situation like the Middle East, which is so combustible, where there is so much at stake, where everybody on all sides are kind of quite understandably hypersensitive to almost a stray comma or a capital letter, for that kind of Trump style, where he clearly massively enjoys provoking debate, massively enjoys stirring up attention around something, you can look already at some of the things that he's done, and this source I was talking to this morning said that he got what he wanted. So he threatened tariffs against Mexico. They say, okay, we'll send some military, some personnel to the border. Oh, tariffs miraculously are on delay. What did he do? He made a threat. He got some of what he wanted. But when you...
Although some of those troops are there already, we think.
Sure, but when you apply that to a situation so fraught, not that like dealing with the Mexican border is straightforward and not delicate, I'm not suggesting that for a second, but when you apply that to situations that are so fraught, so difficult at this time when the ceasefire is, barely a few weeks old at that critical first stage, I think the consequences of this are really, really hard to spell out. But goodness me, on that particular issue, it puts the UK government and other Western governments in a bind, because the stated position, for as long as any of us can remember, have been we back as two-state solution. That has to be, everything has to be working towards that. And then if, one of your main allies has basically trampled all over any notion of that, it's really, really difficult.
Now, one of the trademark things in the last 5 years of Newscast, and the few years before that of BrexitCast, was that we would take serious subjects very seriously and quite rigorously. Then we would take the mickey out of ourselves quite seamlessly. And so now I'm going to get everyone in the audience to put their party hats back on, because it's not just our birthday this week, it's Jeremy Bowen's birthday tomorrow. So happy birthday, Jeremy, and thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you very much.
But before you get to celebrate, you've got to go into the 10 o'clock news. So we'll let you go off and do that now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you. Yeah, don't wear that on the news. Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. Thank you. He didn't seem to mind we didn't get him a present. Oh, it looks great, Paddy.
Well, look, there's a few other people. There's other noddies in here.
Looks a bit tight on your head, Paddy.
The problem is, Chris, I was then going to say, tell us what's happening with the Chagos Islands.
At this point, I'll maybe remove that. Yeah. Was that a serious question? Do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
So...
Actually, should we do the background first?
So let's talk about the Chagos Islands, because it cropped up in Prime Minister's question. So this archipelago of islands in the Indian Ocean, hugely strategically significant, hugely important military base for the UK and the US, a place called Diego Garcia. There's been a long-running row going back years about the true sovereignty of those islands and basically whether the UK has a legitimate right to hold on to them. Under the last government, there was a whole load of rounds of negotiations, 11, I think, under the last government, over trying to resolve this, with various international bodies saying that basically the UK's ongoing claim didn't have any legitimacy. This was one of the many challenges that Keir Starmer inherited and continued to look at on becoming Prime Minister. And the conclusion arrived at was that the islands should be ceded or handed over to Mauritius, but with a 99-year lease to allow the US and the UK to continue using this base in Diego Garcia. Fast forward to November, and Donald Trump wins the election and has made it clear that he's not particularly keen on it. Oh, and there was another general election going on as well in Mauritius, which was a complicating factor. And so you arrive at now where the government's position is one where I was speaking to somebody very senior in government yesterday who was all over the detail of this, who said, look, if you are a country that wants to be seen around the world to be a believable interpreter and a respecter of international law, then there is no way other than to look at this and recognise that there has to be some sort of deal struck that honours that, whilst also ensuring that the base, which is hugely important, continues for the foreseeable for the UK and US to have access to. But, and they also said, interestingly, that in their view, speaking to people in the bowels of the State Department and the Pentagon and the White House, non-political civil servant types, and people who are involved in, spookery and all of that kind of stuff, that their view is that this is a workable solution. But Donald Trump very well might not, particularly if you are somebody who has railed against and made something of your political signature, railing against what he might describe as the deep state, etc., etc. And then in the UK context, you have an argument that I think is increasingly politically difficult for the government to make, however logical as they see it, the arguments about the challenges in the courts are, which is that you have opponents, not least the Conservatives, who are able to say, hang on a minute, am I right in saying you are voluntarily handing over a collection of islands and then going to spend an awful lot of money handing it over to the very people you've given it away to and put a ticking time bomb of a 99-year thing on this idea? Why don't you say, get lost, we're keeping the islands, and just carry on regardless? That's the kind of thrust, if you like, of the counter-argument. And that is quite a difficult argument, and speaking privately to some other people in government, they recognise that is an increasingly difficult argument to prosecute.
And actually, Laura, listening to Radio 4 at 6:37 this morning,
Yeah.
which is a good slot, I used to be in that slot, we heard our friend of Newscast, Henry Zeffman, saying, I was speaking to some senior people in government last night, and actually there's quite a few kind of ministerial level people within the operation who do not think this deal is a great deal.
Yes, so there are some people inside Whitehall who don't think that this is a particularly good deal, who don't think it's been particularly well explained. There's something else that's also really important in all of this, is that Mauritius is a country that has got lots of links to China.
Yeah.
China is strategically Donald Trump's #1 enemy. China is not also a country that the UK is completely groovy and comfortable with doing lots and lots of business with these days. So it is part of that sense that in the 2020s, should a country like the UK, that is proud of abiding by international law, that wants to be a stable democracy, that wants to do everything by the book under a Prime Minister like Keir Starmer, but should it be a country that puts things like that over the tough pragmatism of the 2020s, where with more and more strongmen knocking around, what you basically have to do is pick a side. And somebody who was in the former government with the Conservatives, who had this as one of the things on their desks, was saying to me this morning, essentially, we were just carrying on talks with them because we knew we had to have talks, because the court said that we have to have talks. But if we had to have somebody from Mauritius coming to see us in London, and you would take them out and give them a nice time and listen to them seriously, but we had no intention of ever actually doing anything other than carrying on the talks. So the decision was, for there not to be a decision, then you get the Labour government coming and saying, well, this all looks a bit messy, we ought to tie this up. That would be the right thing to do. But what was being kind of sketched out to me this morning is that the realpolitik, pragmatic thing to do in this situation, with all the strategic interests around, is actually just keep the talks going on and on and on, because not making a decision is making a decision. And I think the government might end up in real trouble on it, because when it first blew up, then Nigel Farage, for example, was already on it. Now we're some months later, there's obvious signs of disquiet inside the government, and the new government in Mauritius is making a lot of noise.
But older newscasters will be hearing you auditioning for the role of Sir Humphrey in Yes, Minister.
Oh,
because
really?
You're basically, it's an episode where Laura would be saying, Minister, what we could do is have talks about talks. And then the Prime Minister would go, oh, yes, and do we agree anything? No, Prime Minister, we don't agree anything. We just have talks about talks.
Exactly. It was suggested to me this morning, even you take a representative of Mauritius in whatever shape or form, you take them for a nice tea at the Savoy, you make them feel special, you show them a good time, you listen seriously to their concerns, but you don't decide anything. And you allow what is a messy status quo to go on for however. And, well, maybe I never thought of being a civil servant until you said that. That would be suboptimal, I think.
And again, a bit like our conversation about the Middle East, throwing forward to that moment in a few weeks where the President and the Prime Minister are stood next to each other, and you've got this brash New York real estate billionaire and the international human rights lawyer. And looking at those two incredibly different characters and the prism through which they approach this particular issue. Now, as far as the domestic political pressure that I think is building on the government on this issue, and pretty awkward for them, they potentially may be spared if, before they consider, and at the moment they don't seem to be giving any outward indications they're about to change their position, even if there are noises off within saying, hang on a minute, this is a bit of a hard sell. They may be spared domestic political awkwardness if they hold to their view for as long as it takes Donald Trump to say it's not happening.
Yeah, and also...
and then they can say, well, we tried our best, but
the other...
That would be such a diss, though, right? If the first big real move between Trump and Starmer, beyond the kind of warm words, oh, my mum was from Lewis and I love playing golf, and Starmer saying, yes, of course,
Me too, I
we
love
love
golf.
America. If the first concrete real thing is for Trump to say, I'm going to unpick one of your decisions that you made that you thought was the right thing. That would be such a kind of demonstration about who's really in charge in that.
But then equally, if the Prime Minister were to about turn before that point, it would look like he was bowing to the inevitable. So, I mean, yeah, it's going to be quite a thing.
The phrase that was rattling through my head, Laura, while you were talking about the Sir Humphrey stuff was, does this mean a British...
something else while I was talking.
No, I was
Never happened before.
No, I was being inspired.
I was
by
doing my shopping list. I was just thinking,
What are you getting this week?
washing powder, don't use washing liquid.
Cheddar?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I do
Parmesan?
go on. No, what was
Sorry.
rattling around your head?
Does this mean a British Prime Minister can say to somebody across the negotiating table, I'm sorry, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed?
But also, what it does do, it's the bones rattling on the days when we owned other parts of the world. And so one of the things that's here and one of the things that's there in Gaza is when we drew lines on maps. And there is a big political fault line, and there'll be many newscasters who want to put that era behind. And that is what many people who, in the ideological opposition part of the Labour Party, when they weren't the government, would have thought, what business is it of ours to have these islands in the middle of the ocean, not ours, thousands of miles away? That's a perfectly respectable position for people to hold, and there will be people in the audience who have that opinion. But it's a big pickle when you've all got the levers of government and Donald Trump breathing down.
Paddy, I've just had a message saying your online shopping is being delivered any second. But there has been a substitution. I hate to break it to you.
Well, I hope it's not the 0 or 0 option that's been...
I'm not sure what you're getting at. Anyway, right, thank you very much, you three. Thanks for joining us here on the stage. Thanks to the newscasters here in the Radio Theatre celebrating our 5th anniversary as a daily news podcast, although as Chris always points out, that didn't include Saturday and Sunday then. Those glorious days were a few years later. And thanks to you two for listening, and especially if you've been with us through all those episodes when we started doing this every weekday 5 years ago. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.